stage, how do you capture all of those costs? The first thing you want to do is make sure that you've got your team together, all the people who are the experts in doing this, because I think you're all K awardees, so you're kind of starting out in understanding how to do this process. So your first one is if you have a grants manager in your department or your college that you can work with. I think in medicine, many people do now. If you don't have a grants manager, your sponsor program officer will certainly help. They will, even if you have a grants manager, but that would be the first person I would go to. And then finally, your department or division administrator should be able to offer some help as well if you have specific questions about particular line items. So you need to know who those people are, be comfortable with them, talk with them about what you need so that they can help you build a budget. These folks, maybe not the department or division administrator, but your SPO or your grants manager definitely are going to have a budget template. So an Excel spreadsheet that's got the different line items, especially built for the SF 424, so the forms that we use for our federal budgets. So you want to be starting using a template that has already got you partway there to categorizing things in the way that our sponsors are expecting. So the budget that you're building at the essence is the financial. Yeah, somebody have a question?
Hi.
Hi, this is Kara. Hi.
Oh, no, you did. It's all good.
Oh, okay. No question?
Yeah, she has been since the beginning.
Okay, I think, can everybody make sure they're muted if they don't have a question?
Okay,
so
awesome. Thank you so much, Deb. I appreciate it. Okay, bye. Perfect. Thanks. Bye.
Okay. So the budget is the financial expression of your scope of work. So when you're building a budget, it's not going to be a one and done thing. As you are building your research plan, your budget is going to change and modify along the way. So it's really important to work with your grants manager or SPO to go through different iterations until you get to the actual final budget once your scope of work is finished, that you figured out what it is. And another point that is important to make is that your budget is an estimate. We're not looking for, in most cases, unless we're talking like federal contracting, which I don't think any of you would be at that stage in your career. For grants, we're looking at just an estimate, what we think is going to happen, because a scope of work for a grant, you want to be specific, of course, but we know with research, you don't quite know what you're going to find, or it wouldn't be research, right? So we're only worrying about getting it as good as we can. We're not worrying about $2.50 worth of items. Okay, so we want to make sure we're budgeting enough, and we're thinking about this as an estimate, and we're not going to get too fine-grained about it because there's no sense in it because of the nature of what you're doing. There's two different kinds of costs that you may run into. Sponsor costs are the ones that whoever you're applying for is going to pay for. So if you spend $100 on widgets and it's an NIH grant, NIH is going to pay for the $100 in widgets. There are some grants that require what's called cost share. Cost share sometimes is known as without cost, which it's not, and it's sort of a misnomer. So cost share is the cost of the research that is not borne by the sponsor, it's borne by OSU or some third party. So it's not uncommon for foundations to require us to cost share a certain portion. Maybe it's a 50-50 cost share, or maybe they just require you to cost share the faculty effort, for instance, like they won't pay for it, but we all know you're working on it, so there's cost share inherent in that. So your entire budget is comprised of the sponsor cost plus the cost share. It's just that usually we're showing just the sponsor cost in the budget in the proposal. And your SPO will direct you if you need to show the cost share as well. So in these budgets, you've got some major, big, high-level categories. I'll talk about personnel on the next slide because I know that's probably a major question that many of you have. And that is going to be your salary, benefits, and then tuition if you've got graduate students. Materials and supplies, travel costs, services, like core services, that kind of thing. Equipment, that would be anything that costs $5,000 and has a useful life of more than a year. So talking big things that cost a lot of money generally. If you've got subawards to other institutions. So if you're working with the University of Michigan and they need some of the money off of this, that's a subaward budget that we'll have to worry about. Consultants are people. So it's a contract like a subaward, but it's with an individual person. So those people just cannot be OSU employees, and I believe they cannot be affiliates either. So they have to be kind of clean and separate from the university. Actually, I think maybe from the state of Ohio. I think that's actually the requirement. It's broader than that. So it's a pretty broad thing. And then finally, F&A, or facilities and administration costs, also known as indirect or overhead. It's now 57.5% of modified total direct costs. So it's like your total costs minus certain items like equipment. And if you are working with industry, the rate is 64.9%, unless you're doing a clinical trial, in which case it's going to be whatever the policy of your college is. Like in my college, it's 30%. In medicine, is it still 26%? I don't know if anybody knows the answer to that. Do you know the answer, Stuart?
I do not.
Okay, so when I was there a few years ago, it was 26%. I don't know if it's been raised or not. Okay.
There are a couple of questions here in the chat about budgeting.
Oh, please.
So one of our participants got some advice regarding his first R01 submission to keep my budget relatively small as a new investigator. Do you agree with this, or just budget what it will take to do the work?
Well, you should definitely be budgeting what it'll take to do the work. If you feel, or your mentors feel, that keeping the budget to a modular, which is $250,000 or less per year, is the smart way to go, then you'll have to scale back your scope of work to make sure it fits the budget, because you don't want to be creating a scope of work that the budget's too small to pay for. Reviewers know. They know how much stuff is going to cost, and they're going to see that discrepancy and they're not going to like it. So that's one bit of advice. The other one is just thinking about who your team is for the R01. If you're kind of like the main person, you're the main PI on this, and you're new, you've only had a K award, this is your first R01, your mentor probably have more to say, but if it's just you and not a lot of other highly experienced people, then I guess I would wonder, if I were a reviewer, if we want to put that big investment in somebody who's brand new to this, and that you don't have like a really experienced team working with you. So I think it probably depends upon the nature of your proposal. That would be my feeling on that subject.
Yeah, someone else commented they thought that if you budget too low, the reviewers may think you don't know what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I know in our grant writing workshops, we have John Chrisman, who leads them, always discourages people from using modular budgets because you really can't increase it for inflation or anything like that.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I guess if you start out a little smaller, like a little bit less than 250, inflation will go there. And I guess the other thing on modulars are nice. They're easy. You should still do a detailed budget so that you know what you're getting yourself into. But the thing is that they invented the modular budget umpteen years ago. I mean, I think it even preceded me, which I'm getting old now. So, so they have not increased that $250,000 cap since the very beginning, a couple of decades ago. So what you're able to buy with a $250,000 modular budget has only decreased over time. So I think there's a lot to be said for forgetting about the modular budget and just going for a non-modular. If you need $260,000 a year to do your work, that's not a lot more than $250,000 a year to do your work. So I wouldn't consider that to be a giant budget. I mean, I think once you're getting over $300,000 a year, now you're starting to look into a much bigger scope of work, a much bigger investment on NIH's part. You said you had some other questions in there. Did anybody
Yeah,
else?
what is the difference? Here's one. What is the difference in roles between grants manager and the sponsored programs officer?
That's a really good question. And I wish I could tell you what the clear line in the sand is, but I can't because there isn't one, unfortunately. Here's the way I think about it. The grants manager, in my opinion, and from what I have seen, and this is how I run into my college, is your person that you talk to and you see on a regular basis. Like, you can walk into this person's office easily and ask to just tell them, hey, I got a proposal. I need help with a budget. And they should know enough about your research to ask some smart questions about your budget line items. Okay. They're going to work with the sponsored program officer to make sure that your budget is good to go, because your sponsored program officer is the business official. This is the person who is authorized to sign the proposal on behalf of the university, because when you're putting in a proposal, it's not you technically, it's the university who's putting it in, and you are the principal investigator. So like, you'll be in charge of it, but it's the university who's putting in the grant, and the SPO is the person authorized to sign off on that. And they're also trained to be looking for compliance issues, to make sure all the pieces of the proposal are assembled properly, and that it's going to go through grants.gov smoothly. So, and they're the ones who are going to get notifications as well. So think of your SPO as being the more outward facing part of the continuum between a grants manager and a SPO, and the grants manager is the person who faces you more specifically. Does that answer the question, I hope?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right. Are there
My
other
laptop is 10 years old. I need to replace it. Can I use the grant funds to buy a new laptop for my office?
It depends on what you're using your laptop for. So if you are using your laptop to do the work for the grant, then I say, yeah. If your laptop is 10 years old and you can't run the latest statistical package because it's just dog slow and you need the statistical package to do your work, absolutely. I don't see any problem with that, unless the sponsor doesn't allow it. There are sponsors who won't pay for computers for that,
Yeah.
That kind of an expense.
Because isn't that sometimes the NIH says that's the indirects are paying for that?
Yeah, if you really just need a new office computer to do your email and put together classes for teaching and do service stuff, then that's something that your department should be paying for on a regular basis. But if you need it for your research, yeah, absolutely. It should be an allowable expense.
That kind of gets us this question from Nam Chu. I realize the NIH grant rarely allows equipment budget. How can we put equipment in our budget? So yeah, that's always a difficult, what kind of equipment will they fund and what kind will they not fund? That's the line.
NIH.
Yeah.
Oh, NIH funds equipment.
Mhm.
Definitely budget for it. When you're doing an R01 that's modular, you have to know what equipment you're going to need up front, and then we just subtract that out to be able to calculate your F&A. But your SPO and your grants manager will help you with that. But yeah, definitely, most NIH mechanisms will allow equipment, and I budgeted crazy equipment like mag drives for data storage, massive amounts of data storage. So I mean, just yeah, big pieces of equipment are always allowable.
The important thing is equipment is a technical term.
I
Doesn't
thought
just
there
mean
was a restriction on equipment on regular R01.
I'm sorry, can you say that
I
again?
thought you have to put in a special kind of a grant for equipment. It's not possible to do that on a regular R01 for anything more than lab supply.
No, there is a special mechanism. Maybe this is what somebody has referred you to for buying a major piece of equipment. Like if you need to buy you need a $300,000 piece of equipment, there is a major instrument grant type. And then for that one, all you're buying is that piece of equipment, and it's complicated kind of proposal. But if you need to buy a DNA sequencer for your lab, yeah, that should not be a problem at all on an NIH grant like an R01.
So is there some kind of an upper limit at which people will basically say this is beyond regular supplies?
No, not really. One of the faculty in my college, I mentioned about the mag tapes, produces a lot of video as part of his research, and our college can't handle, the server room can't handle the amount of data that he's pulling off. So we budget for tens and tens of thousands of dollars of data storage on his grants. And he got his R1, and we were able to buy the data storage for that, the appliances, and then the tapes as well. So yeah, so as long as you need it for your research, it's going to be directly used for your research, you can budget for that. Okay. All right. There we go. All right. Let's talk a little bit about personnel. I know that this has a lot of questions for folks. And one of the questions that comes up when people are fairly new to this is how much effort you should budget for. And somebody like me can't really tell you that, because it's really based upon how much time you're going to need to do the scope of work that you are creating. But some things to remember. First of all, if you overestimate, like you're doing your best and you wind up overestimating how much effort you think it's going to take up 30% of your time, and when you're actually doing it, you find it's only taking about 20% of your time, we only can charge the grant for the time you're actually spending on it. And for most grants, not all of them, but for most grants, if you wind up having to charge less than what you anticipated, you can use the difference in funds for something else. So, I mean, that's sponsor prior approval in some cases, but this is to say that it's better to budget perfectly and give yourself a little cushion if you're not quite sure, okay? You don't want to under budget and find out later that, wow, this is taking up a quarter of my time and I only budget for 10% of my time. That would be a bad situation where your department is covering that difference. So budget for as much time as you reasonably think you're going to spend on the work. And one of the major problems that happens is that you've got a particular funding opportunity announcement, and not NIH. NIH, this doesn't happen usually, but for a smaller foundation, and it's maybe a $50,000 budget. And if you want to budget 20% of your salary and you've got a high salary and that eats up a lot of your budget, like how do you manage that? You want to have the right amount of effort on the grant, but you can't afford to put that much of your salary on the grant or your co-investigators. This is a case where cost sharing makes sense. So if to do the scope of work, you need to have 20% of your effort on the grant, but I can't afford it, you can only afford 10%. This would be a case where you talk with your chair about cost sharing that 10% difference. And that way, that 20% of your time will be protected to work on the research, but the sponsor is only paying for 10% of your time. Okay, so this is a fairly common thing to happen in medicine. And I think most chairs understand that if they want research done and they've got clinicians, this is what's going to happen. And again, if you overestimate the amount of time that you need at the proposal stage, usually you're going to be able to post a lesser amount of effort when you get the award. You might need to get sponsor prior approval. So let's say that you estimated at the proposal stage you need 30% of your time on the grant, on an NIH grant. If it turns out that you need less than 75% of that amount, of that 30%, then you need to go to NIH to get prior approval, because they require prior approval to reduce your effort by 25% or more, because they consider that to be a change in the scope of work that they want to approve. But if it's anything less than that, you just do it. Anything more than that, they don't care. Anything less than that, you could just do it. And that money that you'd allocated, you can spend it on something else. Okay, so do the best you can and don't drive yourself crazy with doing this estimate. So, and I know that most faculty are not 40-hour week people. What we're talking about when we're talking about percent effort is the totality of your time. If you are a 50-hour week person generally, or 60 or 70 or 80-hour week person, if you think you're going to spend about a quarter of your time, that's 25% or 3 calendar months, even if you work many, many hours a week. We're not worrying about 40-hour weeks. Just think about all of the time that you're working and how much of the time is going to be spent on this research. Okay, so the pie just keeps getting bigger, even if the proportion stays the same. So does that make sense to everybody? Any questions on this?
If you have NIH funding for a particular project, and then you get private foundation funding for a very similar project, I assume that you have to inform the NIH about that, especially nowadays with them looking at support very carefully.
Yeah.
Do you automatically lose, or can you not take the private foundation, or is there some kind of an arrangement that they usually come to?
Well, most foundations, and definitely the federal government, don't want to fund the same scope of work. So if there's overlap, your funders are going to want to see how you can make them not overlap. It's like they could be adjacent to each other. Maybe these scopes of work are adjacent, but they can't overlap, because to the extent they overlap, they don't want to pay for that, which makes sense. You know, why would you get 2 sources of funding for the exact same thing? But if you can show how they're just adjacent to each other or complementary to each other, that's fine. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Okay, so you have to show some kind of subtle difference at least.
Yes, non-overlap. Definitely have to show non-overlap. You know, it may be, I've certainly seen the case where maybe you've got a grant this is for this scope of work, but you get some other little thing that covers expenses that aren't covered by the grant, right? So like this first grant doesn't pay for equipment, but you need this piece of equipment, and you go out and you get another little grant that does pay for that equipment. So that's a complementary kind of situation, and I've seen something like that.
Yeah, that's the other thing I've heard, that it's all right as long as your effort is non-overlapping. I mean, you can have, like you said, different, I mean, you could have very low effort on the private foundation, but use it for equipment primarily or something like that. And it'd still be.
Yeah, I mean, as long as the sponsor is happy with what you're doing. Yeah, for sure. That's a good question. Any other questions on?
There's ask for clarification. Changes in percent effort also fall under the 25% rule regarding NIH pre-approval.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. So if you need to lower your effort by 25% or more for what you proposed, then NIH wants to approve that first. They want to review and approve that first. And to be clear, let's say that the first year is going along just as you proposed, and in the second year you realize, oh, I'm going to need to lower my effort, and I want to do that more than 25%. Put that in your progress report. That's the place where you can officially lower your effort from what the proposal was. So that's a great opportunity that happens once a year to reassess your effort levels. So let's talk a little bit about graduate students, because they're confusing. Your other staff, pretty easy. You just appoint them and away you go, right? Graduate students are a little funkier because they've got candidacy concerns. So there's pre-candidacy and post-candidacy. And while this doesn't matter with regard to their stipend and their benefits, it does matter with regard to the tuition. So if you're appointing a GRA on an NIH grant, the NIH grant will pay for their tuition, and the tuition charges as if it were a fringe benefit. So if you've got your GRA appointed at 20 hours a week, that's full-time for a graduate student, 100% of their tuition is going to charge to the grant. Okay. If they're 10 hours a week, that's 50%. So 50% of their tuition would charge to the grant. And the tuition is calculated pre-candidacy and post-candidacy. So it's cheaper to have a pre-candidacy student or a post-candidacy student because they have fewer credit hours. So when you're at that budgeting stage, unless you are sure about who your graduate student is going to be, it's better to budget for a pre-candidacy student so that you get the tuition dollars in there. And just as a rule of thumb, a graduate student with tuition is about the same cost as a PGY0, PGY1 year postdoc. So they're about the same cost. So if you're vacillating between the two, have your SPO or your grants manager just run the numbers. And if you don't know who you're going to get, you just budget for the one that costs a little bit more. They're around about the same, but just budget for the more expensive one and go. So that's my advice on that. Tuition for if you've got a graduate student on a grant where tuition is not allowable, and there are a lot of those, especially the foundations oftentimes don't want to pay tuition, then that's going to be picked up by your department. So, and that'll be automatically done because there's a coding that happens behind the scenes that just shunts the tuition off to your department. So, so if you got a choice between appointing a GRA to an NIH grant and to a foundation, you probably want to pick the NIH grant because the tuition will get picked up on that. Do you have any questions about graduate students or other kinds of staff on grants? Okay. And, all right. And this slide is the last of my prepared remarks, so you're ready to hit me with your questions. When you get your award, and you all are, I think you're all a K awardees, right? Is that right, Stuart? Everybody's got a K?
Yeah, I think most everyone here has some kind of a K award or equivalent.
Okay, good. So you know a little bit about managing your funds, and I'll say right now is a challenging time for everybody because of the workday conversion. Everybody has, we're all figuring this out together. So doing our best here. The most important thing that you can do when you're managing your funds is make sure that you're communicating with your grants management or your department administrator, whoever is helping you with personnel, because your personnel costs on a K, of course, it's the vast majority of your expenses. Yeah, totally get that because it's 75% of you. But when you get an R1 or another grant, it's still the vast majority of your expenses, only it's more complicated because it's more people. So it's really, really important that you communicate who do you want on your grant? When do you want them to start on your grant? Is there an end date to their appointment? How much effort do you need to have them on the grant? So this is stuff that needs to be taken care of right away when you get a new award. So talk to your grants manager. If you don't know who to talk to, and you don't have a grants manager, start with your SPO, and they should be able to help you kind of work your way over to the right person. Also, your department or division administrator should be able to help you as well. So this is the first priority when you get a new grant, is making sure that your personnel are appointed and appointed quickly. You need to keep an eye on this over time. Sometimes things happen. Somebody makes a mistake and reduces their appointment, and it was completely a mistake. Sometimes people skip an appointment, like they have a whole list of things they need to do and they just miss one. So you really have to check to make sure that everybody's appointed the way you want them to. There's a couple of places for you to look. You can look in the PI portal on the personnel tab. And the other place is the PI dashboard in Workday. There's a section just for personnel that will show you who's appointed, and pretty sure it shows at what level effort. I can't see the PI view, so I'm just going from memory here, but that's a pretty decent way to keep track of your personnel, is looking at that PI dashboard. The other thing to pay attention to are the effort reports that come out 3 times a year. This is kind of, I think of it as a backstop. So the effort reports from January through May were released in June. And hopefully you've looked at those and verified that they're okay and gone ahead and approved them. But when you've got more personnel, like you have students and you have postdocs, make sure you're keeping on top of them, because that's the kind of your last chance for seeing, oh, there was a problem that has to be fixed. Because if something isn't right, if you don't understand it, talk to your grants manager, make sure your personnel are appointed the way you wanted them to be. Because if they aren't, then somebody's going to have to go back and make those corrections. And those corrections are called PAAs today. It's payroll accounting adjustments, so more acronyms. But pay attention to that. And another piece of advice that I think is important is when you get to know who your grants manager is, or your sponsored program officer, whoever you feel most comfortable with, meet with them on a regular basis. If you just have one R01, things are probably going to go pretty smoothly, but it's good practice to maybe talk with this person, like have a meeting, half hour, 15-minute meeting, whatever it takes for you, once a quarter. Just kind of look things over and make sure that they're the way you want them to be. And if there are any problems, you're correcting them fairly quickly. Because generally we want to correct our problems within 90 days of them showing up. So an expense wanted on your project and it shouldn't be there, it should be fixed before 90 days are up. Same thing with your personnel. So the more complicated your projects are, the less time I would put between these meetings. But if you've got a pretty simple vanilla R01, once a quarter is probably okay. And I think over time, just having that meeting will get you more and more comfortable with looking in the portal, looking at the PI dashboard, understanding what you're seeing, and knowing how things flow. When you get a new grant, talk with your grants manager, your SPO, about what leeway you have to rebudget. Some sponsors, like NIH, if you have a modular, there's kind of no rebudgeting. It's not a thing when you have a modular budget. You just have to think about that percent effort and deviations from that. But other sponsors are really particular about this. So they will only allow you to rebudget 25% of the entire budget, or 10% within line items. Or I had one years ago, which I wanted to tear my hair out, where they allowed no rebudgeting whatsoever. And even $1 rebudgeting, we had to go back for prior approval. So it really runs the gamut on what you're allowed to do. So know what you're allowed to do before you get going on your project. And again, set up a meeting to go over those grants financials regularly, just until. It's a good practice just in general, but it's also a great way to really get a good feel for how to do this in the long run for the rest of your career. Okay. So that's the end of Carla's just talking at you show. So I am going to end the slideshow and let's see, get back to not sharing. Go. I am completely failing. You would think I would know how to do this after all of this time. And it is not cooperating with me. Okay, then. Just gonna see a blank screen until I figure this out. So go ahead and shoot your questions over to Stuart, and he'll read them to me, I guess.
Yeah, or you can ask them out loud. And while you're thinking about your next question, there's one here. Can budget for grad students be reallocated to postdocs after grant approval?
In most cases, yes. Yeah. But before you think about when you're putting together your budget, if you don't know if you want a graduate student or a postdoc, that's really unclear at that point. Definitely talk to your grants manager or SPO to have them game that out for you, because there is no F&A on tuition, okay? So that might make a postdoc be the smarter way to go, because whoever you wind up hiring, you don't want to lose money on the deal, right? So if you don't know, go with the one that is more expensive on the proposal side. But generally, you'd be able to do one or the other.
And it also could be maybe a skills question you talk with your PI or other colleagues about who's the best person to hire for this kind of a role too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Graduate students don't know as much as postdocs, obviously. So it depends upon what you're doing. But I know that they're kind of like a beginning level postdoc and a graduate student sometimes can be fairly interchangeable for some grants.
I know people always have questions about budgets, so there must be more questions out here.
Okay, all right. I think somebody just figured out how to stop my screen.
Oh,
share
I
for
was
me.
able to do that. I guess that's a host
Thank you.
privilege.
Sorry.
That's
Okay. All right. So somebody had a question about contract research organizations for DNA sequencing or mouse model type work. Greg, can you talk a little bit more about this? So
Yeah. So, I mean, we have a lot of great cores here, but still there's a lot of work involved. And sometimes you might not have the experience. And one thing I run into a lot is that people want to add mouse in vivo models to the kinds of experiments I do, even though I don't necessarily feel like they're the most important for some of the studies, but you know, the reviewers still ask for them. And I know during the pandemic, some of the researchers here had gone to like other outside laboratories that would do like mouse PDX models or mouse toxicology studies, things like that. And obviously pharmaceutical companies almost exclusively do this these days. How does the NIH view that? Because it's not something you usually see in a lot of NIH proposals, but it does seem like that's kind of the way science is going. I just don't know if the NIH has caught up to that yet, or how those are viewed. I would also imagine it's pretty expensive and they may not think it's good value.
well, I guess it would be a purchase service, right?
Right.
So yeah, so purchase services are generally okay on an NIH grant. I don't think it's a problem to budget for it as long as you need it, right? And especially if you don't have the ability to do that work here at OSU, or it's not easily done at OSU, or it's not well done at OSU, then it makes complete sense to be contracting that out to another organization. And maybe it costs a little bit more, but if the outcome is what you need and it's timely and you can trust the organization to do good work, then I don't see why not. I would agree. I haven't seen this very much, but I would guess it's because people haven't caught up with being able to do it. So I think that's more of you're probably on the cutting edge of budgeting when it comes to this.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I do it.
Cutting edge of budgeting. I know that's interesting. You can actually be that way.
I'm sorry.
So you can actually be on the cutting edge of budgeting. That's impressive.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Do you have any advice about reallocating funds because COVID prohibited planned activities like funds budgeted for travel?
Depends upon your sponsor. So if you had allocated on a K award that you're going to spend, $2,500 a year on conferences, you can spend that on pretty much anything else that goes along with your career development and the scope of work. So I don't think there's any need to be too picky about that. Other sponsors might be a little more picky about it. Depends upon what your rebudgeting authority is. So I'd go back to that rebudgeting authority. If you're allowed to rebudget, then you do. Does that answer the question, Laura? I know that was kind of vague.
So I'm confused on like where do you get the authority from, I guess, to rebudget, and within like what kinds of activities could you rebudget something like that?
Okay, so do you have a K award or
Yeah.
do you have a different
Yeah.
K award? K award, very flexible when it comes to those non-personnel funds. So if you budgeted $2,500 for travel last year and you couldn't use it for travel and you're doing mouse work, you can spend it on buying mice. That's not going to be a
okay.
problem at all.
Okay,
So I think you're only going to run into trouble when you've got probably a nonprofit that expected you to do travel. Like that was part of required travel in the proposal. Like they said, hey, you've got a budget for attending our annual meeting. And then they didn't have the annual meeting. So that might be something that you might want to talk with your sponsored program officer about, requesting approval to spend those funds on something else.
great, thank you.
And that's just a case of saying, I want to spend them on this, rather than the travel that didn't happen.
Got it, and thank you.
So that's another role that your sponsored program officer plays. They're the ones who, because they're the business official, they'll send the email to the sponsor with your request, asking for the approval to rebudget. So that's another role that they play. Good question.
Other questions? Anybody else on the cutting edge of budgeting?
That just sounds so ridiculous. I'm sorry I said it now.
Well, maybe someone who can stump Carla.
All right, we'll see you, Dr. Owen.
Is there any mechanism at all for asking for more money after getting a grant?
It depends. It depends. It's unusual. It doesn't, so it doesn't happen very often. But here's a common one, the most common one scenario for NIH is if you have a graduate student or a postdoc who is underrepresented in science. So let's say you have an African-American graduate student and you would like this person to work on the research for your R01, you could apply for a supplement to pay for that student's stipend, benefits, tuition, and some research expenses. So that would be something that would happen after you get your award. So I think that's the most common thing that I've seen with NIH.
And that's the only scenario. It cannot be just for a extra postdoc or who's not.
I've never seen that. I think that it would be highly unusual. I could see it if you have like a big NIH sponsored clinical trial that NIH has sunk a lot of money into already, and something comes up and you need more money than anticipated because of something unusual happened. Like your freezer broke down and you absolutely have to have a freezer to store the specimens that NIH just spent $8 million acquiring. You might be able to get something, for that. But it would be highly unusual. It's not the norm. So budget for your postdocs right at the proposal stage is, I think, the message. Think of what you may need as well as what you definitely know you're going to need. So there's money to do the things you need to do.
There are also reentry supplements for those who for some reason have been pulled out of research and want to go back in. It's kind of like the diversity supplements, but it's, again, that's a special kind of candidate.
Yeah. But
we do have reentry diversity supplements and reentry supplements at NCATS that funds the CCTS. And so they have a deadline November 1st each year for applications for that. So I can get you more information on that sort of supplement.
Yeah.
And there are sometimes very special administrative supplements that in the institutes will release too on an irregular basis, right? That may or may not coincide with your own research that could benefit.
Yeah.
But that's depending on the institute and what they're funding.
Yeah. Their supplements are unusual, but definitely with the diversity supplements, they're worth pursuing. Pursue those candidates, and then you can pursue that money. It's a great way to broaden the scientist pool. So I think they're good. It's a good pot of money, and it's a good opportunity to be looking at. So, and Laura says NSF has REU and workshops. Yeah, absolutely. The REU is research research experience for undergraduates. So that would be different level if you have an NSF grant. And I think those are fairly common, actually. They're awarded more commonly than NIH's diversity supplements are.
These are good questions. Any others? There must be more.
How many of you do industry-sponsored clinical trials? Does anybody here work on those?
I have one.
You've got one? How's that going? They're a little different.
You know, from a budgeting funding standpoint, it hasn't been much of a problem. The trial itself is having some issues with COVID and everything, but
Yeah.
the budget hasn't been one of them.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, the industry-sponsored ones they're kind of a different ball of wax. You have the same sorts of expenses generally, like your personnel and such, but the industry is going to negotiate hard to try to bring the cost down. So a lot of times we don't wind up appointing the PI to those contracts. So
I don't know. I kind of had the opposite experience, and this kind of gets back to the CRO thing. Like the amount these CROs charge is crazy. So even like budgeting, I wouldn't say I double it, but being really conservative, like 30% of the experiments are going to fail, and this is going to maybe take up to 30% longer, you know, just really conservative estimates. I think our budget still comes in way less than what they would typically pay to like a CRO or something. So like at least for this one trial, when I proposed correlative studies, like they didn't bat an eye at those costs. And like I said, they were pretty conservative. Because those CROs charge these drug companies a lot.
Well, I think the thing that blows most people's mind is what overhead actually costs. So, like our federally negotiated rate is 57.5%, and people think, oh, that's so awful. How could it possibly cost that? Well, it does. But if you were to go out into industry, it's way higher, over 100%. So, when industry pretends to have a heart attack at how much it costs to do research here, that's probably pretend horror, because they know how much it costs, and we're probably not doing it for as much as it would cost them. That's why they're coming to us in some cases. So
yeah, I mean, I would definitely, if anybody ever pushed at you, it's amazing how much. I went to visit a drug company a while back, and this was a fairly large drug company that had several drugs in clinical trials and a few approved, and their office was like just slightly larger than my house. Like they had no labs whatsoever. They just did everything with CROs, like absolutely everything. So you can really get just about anything done. So anytime you're budgeting, say do something, I'm sure you could go out and find a CRO that does it. And I bet their budget for it is way higher than yours.
Yeah. Another thing that I always tell faculty when you are budgeting to work with an industry partner is that don't tell them our F&A. So you tell them, figure out your budget, how much it's going to cost to do that scope of work, and then just tell them this is going to cost $100,000. Right? My budget came out to $100,000. This is $100,000, and that includes the F&A. So you just don't even mention it, because if you mention it, then they got to argue with you. It's like a point of principle in many cases. But just roll that cost in. And if you have to do a line item budget, you can roll the F&A cost right into each of the line items. They don't have to know. What do they know? We're just telling them what it costs, and what it costs is inclusive of our overhead. And that will help you get through the budgeting process with industry a lot faster if you just take that out of the equation and roll it in. Any other questions? because we're coming up on the end of our time here. I've talked for an entire hour. Oh, you're on mute, Stuart.
I was trying to say, I hope you found what Carl had to say was informative. And hopefully it did answer the questions that you have. And I think you did include your email, I think, in your first slide. And so hopefully you noted that down, or I can let you get in touch with her. But also remember your college grants officers and your sponsor program officer. They'll have the most specific answers to your specific budget questions.
Yep, always here to help. So let me know if you have other questions.
Well, thanks everyone. And we'll look forward to seeing you next month at our next K Lunch and Learn.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks, Carl. I appreciate you doing that.
Oh, no problem, Stuart.
I thought that was really good advice, Dan. Just roll up the F&A rate in the individual line items. That's very clever.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, you totally have to do it that way. Every
Mhm.
once in a while, though, they'll get clever and want to come back, and get it broken out, but usually they don't.
Yeah.
They don't want to know either. And they have to say something.
Yeah. That's interesting.
So anyway,
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
all right, thanks, Stuart. Take care.
Goodbye.